Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Teamwork, the Essentials. My name is Chris Walchuk. I'll be facilitating our session today. Before we get started, just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you've been on our sessions in the past, you know that we love to hear from you throughout the session. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, ideas, the way we will be communicating with each other is via the chat box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there are a number of circles. There's a blue one with a bubble in it. If you click on that, that's your chat box, and it'll open up to the right side of the screen. You could either set it to all participants so everybody sees your messages or your chats, or you can set it to host and presenter or all panelists. And this way, I will be the only one who sees those comments, and I can pass that information on to the group. We are also recording this session, so we'll have this available if you'd like to hear it again or share it with any of your teammates or anybody else who may have missed it. So with that said, let me share with you what we plan to talk about in the time that we have together. So it's all about teamwork. You're all leaders in your organization. You lead teams, and you want to get the best out of those teams. We know that 2 heads are better than 1, and 3 or 4 are better than 2. Teams work, but it takes work to make the team work. And sometimes, unfortunately, we don't spend enough time creating that sense of team, focusing on those skills that are most important for us to have effective teamwork. And as a result of that, we sometimes have poor teamwork. So we're going to look at some examples. We're going to ask you actually for examples in your own experiences of the best and worst cases of teamwork. The worst are obviously those things that we don't want to do. The best are our best practices and the things that we're going to incorporate into the skills that we talk about today. We're also going to talk about communication and cooperation and how critical that is for teamwork. We're going to talk about how important it is to reinforce each other. That's a motivator when people have good reinforcement, especially positive reinforcement. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't get along with everybody. Oftentimes we don't get to choose our team or choose the team that we're going to be on. And human nature says we don't always get along with everybody. We don't always like everybody. We find some people difficult, and yet we need to figure out how to manage that and how to manage conflict when it does happen. The goal being we want to work in unison. We want to inspire each other as team members, and you as the leaders are obviously there to inspire your teams. So we wanted to start us off with a quote from Henry Ford: "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success." And when you think about it, teamwork really is a process. Teams need to connect. They need to bond in order for them to become those well-oiled machines. There was a psychologist by the name of Bruce Tuckman, and he had this theory, and you've probably seen this before, the stages of team development. And they included forming, storming, norming, and performing. So initially when a group gets together, they form. And what does that mean? They meet, they get to know each other, they establish bonds, they establish their ground rules of how they're going to operate together. And they really make an effort to get to know each other's styles, so that they can start meshing together. What happens when we start getting to know people? We start getting comfortable. And what happens there is maybe our true colors show. That's when a team sometimes goes through storming. Storming is that, pushing boundaries, really kind of saying what we feel. And so think about any relationship you've ever had, right? First is the honeymoon period. Everything is nice. That's the forming stage. But then once you start saying, oh, that's not so nice, or that's a little irritating when that person does that, right? That's the storming phase. But if we can get past the storming, we get to what we call norming. People connect with each other. They accept each other's viewpoints. They learn how to resolve those differences. And that leads them to performing, where they have this open, trusting environment. They focus on their team goals, and they become that well-oiled machine. That's what we're striving for. That's what we want to get to. So let's talk a little bit about your own experiences with teamwork. And so for the purposes of this exercise that we're going to do, you could either think in terms of your team that you lead, or maybe a team that you are currently on or have been on in the past. Let's look at some poor examples of teamwork, what happens when teams are not effective. Let's look at some great examples, and then how you fit into all of that. So let's start with the negative experience. We all probably have had at least one negative team experience. Tell me about it. What are some of those challenges that happen when we're trying to work as a team? Give me your thoughts in the chat box. Okay, somebody said poor communication. Yeah. Oh, and we're going to talk quite a bit about communication, because that really is one of the key skills. Again, think about any relationship that you're in, that you've ever had. If we can communicate, we can probably get past anything. But if we're not communicating, that's when that breakdown happens. What else? What are some other experiences you've had where people basically, where it didn't work out? Okay, personality differences, someone said. Yeah. Look, we're different. That's the beauty of a diverse workforce, is that we're all different in so many different ways. And if we can learn how to work with that and appreciate that, we get the best of everything and everyone. But let's not fool ourselves. When people are different than we are, when they think differently, when they act differently, when they have different backgrounds, that can be sources of conflict. And on a team, that's exactly what happens. Somebody else said objectives don't get met or not done as well as possible. Yeah. So what happens sometimes is when teams get caught up in some of that storming and kind of doing their own thing, they don't meet those objectives. And that's a problem, because obviously that's the whole point of working as a team, so that we can meet those objectives that are set out for us. Excellent. Anything else? How about different just work ethics, different work styles? That can create problems and can hold back a team, right? Let's say I'm the biggest procrastinator in the world and you are the most organized person in the world, and we're trying to work together. And I keep putting things off, and I'm making you completely nuts because you want to have this thing done. Simply having those different work styles can create conflict for us. All right, what about best experiences? So at the risk of just saying the opposite of what we just said, but in your own experiences of being on a really, really effective team, what are some of the components that made being on that team so worthwhile, so helpful? Okay, somebody said everybody does their part. Oh, excellent. So having that accountability, right? That everybody knows what they're supposed to do and everybody comes through. It's that reliability, it's that ability to count on each other, to make sure that things are happening the way they should. Okay, somebody else said great communication. Yeah, right? We said if we have poor communication, it doesn't work. But when we have really good communication, where people feel like they can be honest with each other, straightforward with each other, we're usually able to resolve any of our differences or any of issues that we might fall into. All right, somebody else said people look out for the good of the team, not only their personal responsibilities. Yeah, and that's a huge one. You probably heard the saying, there's no I in team. Well, think about that. There is an I in team. I bring what I bring to the team, right? So there's many I's in the team, but that's where we have to let go of our I. And our focus should be on the betterment of the team goal. It's not about me. And that's hard for some people to deal with. And so how do you fit in? You're the leader of the team. So what's so important for you to do to make sure that your teams are running as effectively as possible? What do you do? Are there any particular things that you find that you do to help your teams? And again, feel free to share that in the chat if you'd like. Okay, somebody said listen to each member's needs. Absolutely. Right? And part of communication that we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes is all about listening, because that's one of the key skills. Walking the talk, someone said. Yes. You are role models for your team. You really, really are. I mean, it's almost like being a parent. Any of you who have children, you know that your kids are watching you. They're deciding, they're making decisions as to what's okay behavior, what's not okay behavior, based on what mom or dad might be doing or saying. Well, your team takes that lead from you as well. And so if you're practicing certain things that maybe don't lead to those successful teams, well, that's what they think is okay, and that's what they should be doing. So, part of that leadership role really is to be that role model. Somebody else said lead by example, don't just delegate. Yep, absolutely. And somebody else said allow them to try something new or differently, and being okay if it doesn't work out exactly the way you would have it done. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. That is such an important point. And again, this is where you set the tone of, are you encouraging people to take risks? Calculated risks, of course. We don't want people, going out and doing things that we know are not going to work. But getting out of their comfort zone and doing things. And if they fail, how do you react to that? Do you react really negatively, in which case nobody's going to take a risk because they're not willing to put themselves out there? Or do you see it as those are our opportunities for growth, for learning, and reward people for at least being willing to take those chances? So again, that's where your leadership really, really makes a difference. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what a cooperative work environment looks like. So first and foremost, contains an awareness and an acceptance of the similarities and the differences that we all share. So I said before, when you're working in a diverse workforce, we need to really recognize those differences and play on them in such a way that we're utilizing the best of everybody. Everybody comes with a different skill set. Everybody comes with a different set of experiences. If we really let everybody use their unique gift and then meld that all together, that's what makes for a cooperative work environment. And the other thing is, what about our similarities? Lots of times people focus a lot of attention, and typically it's negative attention, on the differences, but we're probably more similar than we are different. Maybe similar from work experiences that we've had, especially if we're in a particular field or a particular industry. Maybe we have some life experiences that are common. Maybe several of you are parents, or several of you have a significant other, or several of you have whatever. And so really sharing in all of those things and looking for those similarities, but also welcoming those differences. Focusing on common ground. And the most common, the most basic of that is accepting and respecting each other. Every single one of us needs that, right? That is a basic human need, to be respected for who we are, respected for what we do, how well we do it. And so when team members can give that to each other, and when team leaders, when managers can provide, again, that kind of an example, that really makes a difference in terms of how the teams operate. The opportunity to feel useful and successful at what we do. That, again, is one of those things that motivates people. We all want to feel competent. We all want to feel successful. So are we getting those opportunities within this team environment to really shine, to really use those skills that we've got for the good of the team? There's something bigger than myself, but also for me too, because it helps me to develop those skills even more. And then finally, a willingness and ability to work with anybody and everybody, because that's the idea. So why is this hard sometimes? This all sounds really nice, right? Isn't it great if this can work out? Why is it that we don't always cooperate the way we should? And if anybody's got any ideas before I share ours with you, please put them in the chat. What gets in our way? Somebody said inability to see things other than their way. Yeah, right? It's my way. This is the way I see it. I don't understand. Why don't you see it my way? And so lots of times if we think that our way is the only way, that absolutely squashes that cooperation. Somebody else said personal agendas, not understanding the greater goal. Yeah, and that can be really, really detrimental to a group when the I becomes the more important thing than the we, and people forget about what really makes this team work. So let's look at some other obstacles to cooperation. Disrespectful or rude behavior. I mean, let's face it, we spend more time at work than we do anywhere else, at least waking hours. We spend more time with the people that we work with than we do our family members, our loved ones. I don't know about you all, but I want an environment where I am respected, people are acting in a respectful manner, and are nice to each other, pay attention to each other, greet each other. I mean, little things like that. When we have rude behavior or disrespectful behavior, that really, really does break up teams, because then people start taking things personally. Why didn't he say good morning to me? Why didn't he or she look at me? Why did this happen? And we're wasting valuable time that we could be working together and solving problems on dealing with these kinds of behaviors. When people have rigid thinking, as one of you had said, it's sort of the my way or the highway, and so closed-minded that they're not willing to see things from another perspective. Inability or unwillingness to consider other people's perspectives, right? Doesn't even exist. I can't even get my arms around that one. But lots of times we do. We just see it from a particular perspective. Use a little empathy. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. See it from their point of view. And again, if we can do that, we're going to have much better teamwork. When we have indirect, dominating, or underground communication, otherwise known as gossip. So when things are happening underneath, a few people are talking to a few people, and a few people are talking about that, and a few people are talking about this, and we start having maybe little cliquey things going on and gossipy things going on, that absolutely takes away from people being able to work well together. We already mentioned having really different work styles or approaches to things. Again, we're creatures of habit, and so we like the way we do things. We're comfortable with it, and if somebody has a different way, we're not always that open to seeing that something can be done differently. And then, of course, there's history and reputation, right? Sometimes we might be on a team with somebody that we've had some sort of a history with. Maybe we had a bad experience with them in the past, or worse yet, maybe we just heard from others that they had a bad experience with somebody. And so we decide he's not a good guy or she's not a good person, right? And so we let that get in our way of being cooperative with each other in the present. So let me ask you this question. How many of these characteristics that I listed above are subjective? Give me your thoughts in the chat. Yeah, a couple people are saying all of them, most of them. Yeah, right? It's the way I see things. And so once again, it's really, really important for us to, from a team perspective, it's not just about my way of seeing things. I need to open my eyes and be able to look at different ways. And that's what makes cooperation work. So here's what we need to have a cooperative work environment. We need respect for ourselves and for others. Right? Because sometimes what we have are team members who don't have enough self-respect. And when you don't respect yourself enough, or don't feel maybe that you're contributing, that you're adding something, then what we do is we step back and we play a smaller role. We don't assert ourselves the way that we need to in this kind of a team environment. Sometimes people worry about being too assertive. Can you be too assertive? Yeah. And that could border on or move into aggressiveness. But it's not going to happen if the self-respect is there and the respect for other people. And so if we want to cooperate, that's what we need. We also need to suspend judgment. Let's face it, we can all be judgmental at times, right, of various things. It could be something as simple as a different, work style in a particular way. This is how we've always done it. Why are you doing it this way? To, maybe judgment of people's work ethics or the person themselves or something about them. And so if we can suspend those, we can definitely start seeing that person for who they are and what they bring to the team. Having ownership for our own behavior. That's basically being accountable, owning up to mistakes, problems, apologizing if needed, right? Because that's what we're bringing to that team, so we need to take that ownership. The willingness to communicate openly. And again, we're going to talk about communication skills in much more detail in a couple of minutes. The willingness to be flexible. Because again, think about any relationship you've ever had. Don't you need to be flexible? Because you may be coming from 2 or 3 or 10 different places. And so you need to be willing to look at somebody else's way of doing something and have that flexibility. And then a really key component of cooperation is obviously trust. Trust takes a really long time to build up, but trust can be broken and destroyed in an instant. Tell me about, whether it's from your own experiences or just your own thoughts, what might create mistrust on a team? Because obviously those are behaviors that we want to avoid, because that's not going to help our situation. Okay, somebody said not sharing credit or being a credit hog. Yeah, that's a really huge one. If you ask people, what are some of the things that they really feel, does not work on a team, that would be one of them. When the credit really is intended to be shared, everybody has participated, but whether it's the boss, the leader, or somebody else on the team that starts, tooting their own horn and taking that kind of credit. Somebody else said lying. Yeah, so when people lie, when they miscommunicate or hold back on information, that's definitely another area where mistrust would happen. Somebody else said not doing what they said they were going to do. Yeah, because think about it. On a team, we are counting on each other. We really do. Every single person counts on a team. And the team is only as strong as that weakest link. So it's in everybody's best interest to work together, to help the weaker links so that we all become stronger. It's a reflection of all of us. And when people aren't coming through on what they say they're going to, that definitely creates a lot of mistrust. And somebody else said saying I, not we. Yeah, so that almost goes back to that not sharing credit. It's all about me. I'm the one. I'm the most important thing here, and there's no room for that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some strategies for maintaining that kind of a cooperative environment. So the first one is shifting from reacting to each other or reacting to situations to responding to them. What's the difference between reacting and responding? Oh, and for the previous question, somebody said failing to make real connection with the team member. It's easier to trust someone you feel like you know. Okay, yeah, that's a great point from the previous trust and mistrust question. What about this one? Reacting versus responding. Is there a difference? I react to something. I respond to something. Okay, somebody said reacting is in the moment. Yeah. So something happens, an event happens, and it's my initial knee-jerk reaction to what goes on. And oftentimes, it's an emotional one. And that's just how a lot of us operate, right? Somebody cuts you off. What's your first instinct, right? Maybe you yell, you curse, You have some choice hand gestures for that person. That's a reaction to a situation that occurred. Responding means I actually add some thought into that. So I withhold that reaction. I don't do something in the moment. I wait and give myself even sometimes just a couple of seconds to let the rational part of my brain kick in and say, oh, don't do that. Oh, don't say that. That's not going to go over well. Or maybe you should do this. And so when we're working on a team, this is especially important. If we're having issues on a team, if we're under a lot of stress, it's really easy for people to simply react to that. But if we can step back and respond to it, we're probably going to have a much better situation. We're going to lower the stress level, and it's going to open up that opportunity to communicate. Another thing we should do is focus on the principle versus personality. Right? On a team, again, it's really easy to get caught up in individual people. Well, stick to the facts. What's important? What are we doing? What's this person saying from a factual perspective? Let's not let personality get in the way. We already talked about suspending judgment and how important that is, and really seeking to understand somebody else. Stephen Covey, who you may be familiar with, he wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People many, many years ago. Great book if you have not read it and would like to. One of the 7 habits that Stephen Covey talks about is seek first to understand, then to be understood. Think about that. If any time we interacted with anyone, a team member or a significant other, anybody, if we actually sought first to understand, then to be understood, I think everybody would get along a whole lot better than we sometimes do. Most of the time, it's about me. It's what I need. It's what I want. But again, on a team, remember we've said this several times already, several of you have said there's no I. It's got to be we, and we need to think of it from that perspective. Using a little empathy. Where's this team member coming from? Why are they feeling a particular way? Why do they have a particular opinion? And trying to understand that a little bit more rather than simply reacting to it. A balance needs of self with the needs of the group. Because look, you do have your own needs. There's no question about it. Just because you're working on a team or leading a team doesn't mean that you don't have your own professional needs, your own need to grow and to try things. But again, when we want to have an effective team and a cooperative kind of environment, we need to make sure that we have a good balance between those things. We want to assess our spheres of control and influence. And so basically, depending upon what it is that we're doing together as a team, we need to figure out, do we have control over a particular situation? Do we have influence on what's going on? That's going to help us to determine when we should go after something, pursue something, follow up on something, and sometimes when to just let that go. And so again, if we all practice these types of things when we're working on a team, it really makes a huge, huge difference in terms of that cooperation. All right, let's talk about communication. And I know here we put barriers to communicating on a virtual team because some of you may have virtual teams that you're managing, which makes it really even harder. But really we're talking about communication in general as well. So even if your team is right there with you in a store or whatever it is, the things that we're going to be talking about, these next couple of slides, really are important for all of us. So what gets in our way of communicating effectively? Whether it's literally, it's seeing each other face-to-face in a store, in an office, or when we have a virtual team. What gets in the way of communication? Give me some of your thoughts. Somebody said not communicating enough. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, because sometimes, again, I don't know if it's because we just assume people know what they're supposed to do. We assume that people, are on the same page. That happens in relationships lots of times. Close relationships. You've been with somebody for years and years and years. You almost expect them to be that mind reader, right? Because how would you not know that? And yet, why would they know? If we don't tell them, then why would they know? So a lack of communication or not enough communication absolutely can get in the way. Somebody said failing to make a real connection with that team member. It's easier to trust someone. Oh, sorry, that was the one from before. When you cannot sit down face-to-face with somebody, sometimes the message gets lost in translation. Yeah, so that's one of the big challenges of the virtual kind of environment is because when we are sitting face-to-face with somebody, we have everything going for it in terms of that communication working. We have each other's attention because we're literally looking at each other. We have the opportunity to look at each other's nonverbal communications, and nonverbals are responsible for anywhere between 75 and 94% of our communication. That's what the studies tell us. So think about that. That eye contact that we give somebody, that nod, that smile, that shaking the head one way or another, the hand gestures that we might use, our posture, all of those things really, really tell a story. You've heard the saying, a picture paints 1,000 words, and it really, really does. So lots of times when we're communicating with somebody, we're so concerned about what we're going to say, the words we're going to say. And yet, a rolling of the eyes or a smirk on a face can really change that message entirely. Well, so now think about in a virtual kind of situation where you're relying on the phone or emails, IM messages, text messages. We lack all of that. So there's a lot of room for miscommunication, and like one of you had said, sometimes that message gets lost in translation when we don't get to do that face-to-face. Somebody else said delivery mechanism. Yeah, so how we're communicating, choosing the right means of communication. Sometimes an email is the right thing to do. Maybe there's a lot of detailed information, and it helps to have it in writing, and that is the way to communicate. Maybe sometimes it's just a really quick kind of thing, so a quick IM message or a text message might be the way. Sometimes I need to pick up the phone because the issue really does require some talking back and forth. Or if it's really serious or could be somehow touchy and emotional or something like that, maybe it does need to be that face-to-face. So, yeah, there are so many things that get in the way of our ability to communicate. So the misunderstanding from poor communication, so when we don't communicate effectively, there's clearly room for misunderstanding. We have incompatible communication preferences. And this is an interesting one. So I mentioned the different ways that we communicate, face-to-face, picking up the phone, emails, IM messages, text messages, and all of that. And so we all have preferences, and sometimes those are actually generational. And we do seminars on generational work teams, and when we talk about communication, and this is a generality, so this may not be true of every single person, but those folks who are in the older generations, the baby boomer generations, the older Gen Xers, and certainly the traditionalists, our oldest generation, they definitely prefer that face-to-face or picking up a phone. Because think about it, that's how they've communicated for decades and decades and decades. Where some of the younger generations, so younger Gen Xers or millennials, definitely feel more comfortable with the written communication, emails, text messages, IM messages, quick, easy, fast. So if I'm somebody who prefers, and again, regardless of my generation, if I'm somebody who just prefers to see somebody face-to-face or pick up the phone and hear their voice, and I'm communicating with a team member who will never pick up the phone or will never look at me, come and see me, they're always sending me emails or text messages, you can see how that can definitely become an issue. Remember what Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So if we understand other people's preferences, and that's not to say that they'll always get their way, right? When you're on a team, nobody gets their way all the time, but everybody should get their way sometimes, right? That's the whole idea of collaborating and gaining consensus. And so communication preferences definitely need to be taken into consideration. Lack of clarity or direction. So sometimes our communication, maybe because we're trying to be so quick, it's not clear. In fact, that's happening more and more. If you look at people's emails today, lots of times they're starting to look more and more like IM messages or text messages. Emails used to be more formal kinds of communications, almost like a formal letter. And now it might be a sentence or a couple of words or a phrase. And lots of times, again, people will look at it and not understand exactly what's being asked. And then we're going back and forth saying, well, what do you mean? Well, what is that? What are you talking about? And that can become very, very frustrating. And so think about a team that, if they have that lack of clarity or direction, that leads to a lot of second guessing. And lots of times when we don't quite understand, rather than asking for clarification, we make assumptions. I think this is what she meant. I think this is what he wanted. And then we go with that. And unfortunately, that oftentimes is wrong. So taking the time to clarify, to get a good understanding of what that person means. What about issues that aren't addressed directly, kind of sidetracked, put to the side, especially if there are problems, there's issues that are going on? If we let them go, oftentimes they fester and they become worse. So, we don't want to be a pain and we don't want to address things all the time, but recognize if you don't address it first and it seems to be getting worse, don't keep ignoring it. We need to make sure that we are talking about those things because they can and probably will get worse if not addressed. Another challenge when it comes to communication is, again, distrust and suspicion. So, again, those behaviors that we talked about before can sometimes lead to that and lead to it in our communications. If there's a lack of empathy or the personal connection, like one of you had just said, when you just don't feel connected with somebody and that trust level is just not there. And then any and all distractions. Right? Anything. If there's noise where I am, if my phone keeps going off and beeping and I'm getting notifications and things like that, those are all things that get in our way of communicating effectively as a team. So we could all probably be a little bit better at that. And when we do it, it is amazing how we can really, really establish ourselves as a team and communicate really well. I want to talk a little bit about trust because I know trust is definitely one of those things that really is necessary for a team. And again, sometimes when we're not working with people, face to face all the time, working at a distance, to people working remotely, it only gives more opportunity for a lack of trust or a lack of ability to build trust. So either one of those obviously is problematic. So the way that we can build trust, communicate openly and frequently. Be in touch with each other. Talk to each other throughout the day. If you have people who are remote, are you connecting with them on a regular basis, or is it something that, they're kind of off in no man's land by themselves? To get trust, you got to give trust. So it really is a two-way street. Being honest, being reliable. You all talked about that earlier. Do what you say you're going to do, right? And make those actions visible so people really, really can see that. Make sure that your interactions with the team are consistent and predictable. This is especially true of the leaders, the managers, right? People like consistency. They like to know what to expect. And when we have either a team member, but especially a leader who is just unpredictable, you never know where he or she is going to go or what they're going to think or what they're going to do, how they're going to react. That definitely, creates a lack of trust for people. And of course, as a leader, being accessible and responsive. Having that open door policy, letting people know, especially again if they're remote, listen, call me anytime if you have any questions, you have any issues. Let's talk about this. And again, don't always put it on them to contact you because they may or may not, but staying in contact with them, just so they know you're there, you've got their backs, you're willing to help them out in any way that they would need. If anybody's got any other ideas on things that you do to build trust with your teams, please put it into the chat. I would love to hear that. I want to go back to our communication. We didn't finish talking about that. So sometimes communicating through email, IMs, or chats can be difficult. And so, but yet we rely on it so much. So here are some things that we can do that are going to help us to communicate more effectively as a team. One is checking those things on a regular basis, checking your IM messages, checking your emails, checking your chat on your phone, so that we're responding to people in a timely manner. Because that's the thing, is lots of times people on a team feel like they're out there on their own because they're not getting the responses maybe quite in that timely fashion. Sometimes on teams, part of the ground rules that they establish is that they will communicate at certain times. Maybe every morning we have a meeting where we get together. At the end of the day, once a week, whatever it is, whatever would seem appropriate for a particular team, but making sure, again, that we're checking these things and we're following up on them on a regular basis. Determining appropriate and inappropriate use of email. So we already talked about that, when to use it, when not to use it. Because sometimes we use it thinking, it's just easier, it's quicker, and yet it's not, because it was an issue that really, really warranted either a face-to-face or a phone call. And so it actually starts getting more difficult. There's a lot of emails that go back and forth. Once you start seeing it's taking too long, it's backfiring on you is basically what's happening. So we want to make sure that you are using the right form. Be careful about emotional content in email, because lots of times they create a tone, and sometimes it's not a tone that you necessarily want. Also, with emails and any kind of written communication, write it down and then read it to yourself. Even read it out loud. And think about how that person on the receiving end might be reading that. Because, again, you may have a lack of tone, and that person's going to put their own tone in. Maybe I'm having a really bad day. I just got off a really, really bad phone call, and then you send me an email or a text message, and it's a one-liner, and all of a sudden I'm reading it from the perspective of my current mindset. I'm really unhappy right now. I'm really upset about something. And so I read it with that kind of a spin. That may not have been how you intended it at all, but because I didn't make it clearer. And sometimes, again, when we're trying to be too quick, that's when things can be misunderstood. They might come across as being a little too curt and definitely not meeting those needs. So always remember the receiver's interpretation. That's really what it's all about. It's not about what you're trying to do. It's how that person on the receiving end might read that written communication. Also be realistic about your expectations for responses in terms of how quickly somebody might be able to respond. To expect that somebody's going to respond to you immediately every time may not be realistic. Sometimes we see people who, in all of their emails, in the subject line will put urgent, need response immediately. And really what they are is the boy who cried wolf. And after a while, people start realizing it's not always urgent. So we don't want to overuse something like that. We want people to realize if I use it, it means I really, really need a response. If I don't really need that response right this second, maybe I just want it, but I don't need it, then I shouldn't use that. Because, again, that also from a team perspective, when people do things like that, that also erodes a lot of the trust that people have with each other and certainly affects communication in a negative way. And then lastly, remember, if you wouldn't say it in person, it definitely doesn't belong in an email. And here's where sometimes people do get themselves in trouble. They just feel, they think about the anonymity of like an email or a text message, although it's not anonymous, but sort of there's no face behind it, that they might say something in ways that they would never do if they were on the phone with somebody or face-to-face. And so if we use those as our litmus test of is this appropriate? Should I be putting this in an email? That probably will help us to communicate through written means a little bit more effectively. All right, what about conflict? Do you ever have conflict among your team members or with you and a specific team member, say, for example. How many of you think conflict is bad? If you do, just give me a yes in the chat box. Conflict is not a good thing. How many of you believe what we say here? Conflict can be useful. If you do, give me a yes in the chat box. Okay, got a couple of yeses for the second one. Yeah, so it's funny, most people don't enjoy conflict, right? Nobody walks around saying, "Oh, I'm having this conflict, it's awesome." Right? We don't say that. We say, "Oh my gosh, I'm having this conflict with somebody." It's perceived as this negative. But a conflict really is just a disagreement, or we don't see eye to eye on something. The conflict itself, in most cases, is not the problem. It's how we manage conflict, how we work with conflict, that really makes a huge difference. And because people try to avoid conflict lots of times, they don't know how to deal with it when they are in the midst of it. Somebody else said conflict is needed to help create. Personally directed conflict is not useful. Yep, absolutely. But yeah, sometimes when we conflict, it shakes things up a little bit. It forces us to think a little bit more, to see it from another person's perspective, to broaden our view of something that's going on. But if we do have conflict going on, especially on our teams, we don't want that conflict to start creating those walls, those barriers between people. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we handle conflicts in a constructive way. So first and foremost, fight fair. Right? Any of you who are married or have a significant other, you know that's important. You can fight, you can argue, you can disagree about things, but you got to do it fairly. And fairly means people are respectful, people are listening to each other, they take what the other person is saying to heart. Right? Those make a really big difference. No yelling, cursing at people, putting people down, because that really, again, doesn't help anything. When we're at that stage where somebody is raising their voice, basically they're losing the focus of what's going on and becoming just very tied in the emotions of what's happening. And that usually doesn't get us anywhere, because now you have two or more people who are angry and saying things that they probably are going to be sorry for later. And sometimes it's hard to take those things back. So we want to, again, make sure that we're not engaging in that. We said listening before is a really critical skill, and especially when there's conflict going on. It really is that time to step back, listen to what the other person has to say, hear them. That doesn't mean you're going to agree with them, but you have to hear them. And, when we're in conflict, lots of times we're so dug into our own belief system, our own, I'm right and you're wrong kind of thing, that we stop listening. And that's the biggest mistake that we can make. We need to assess our own behaviors. So stepping back and looking to see, how am I handling this? Am I being professional? Am I speaking the way I should be speaking? Or am I starting to go down that slippery slope and maybe behaving in a way that is showing disrespect for that other person? No personal attacks, because that clearly does not help anything. Focus on the issue at hand. Address only that. Come up with some options and ideas on how we can do something, plan, brainstorm. Those are all good things to do. And don't interrupt. There's also a tendency when there's conflict that, we cut each other off. We aren't listening, so we feel the need to be talking. But when we interrupt each other again, we're showing disrespect for that person, and we're missing really important information. So I said in the beginning that, there are going to be times that you have people on your team, or you're on a team with other people that you just don't like, that you just don't get along with. Something doesn't click. What kinds of people are they for you? What kinds of behaviors maybe do you find difficult to work with or to deal with? If anybody's willing to share that with us in the chat, tell us what those might be. Okay, somebody said self-centered. Yeah, right? That's a difficult one. When somebody really, they go, again, we've said this a few times, goes back to it's just about me. I'm the important one, and not really looking at other people. I find that extremely difficult to deal with too. I also personally find bullies really difficult to deal with. People who don't show that respect, who will, talk over other people, who will, walk over other people because they really just care about who they are. Somebody else said someone who thinks they are always right. Yeah, that's a tough one too, right? Because more than likely that person who thinks they're always right really truly believes that. And so it's almost like nothing you can say or do is going to change their minds. And that's incredibly, incredibly frustrating to have to deal with, especially in a team situation where you have to come to some agreement. You have to come to some consensus. Somebody else said people who are robotic, no passion or excitement for their job. Yeah, absolutely, especially if you're the opposite. If you're somebody who's extremely passionate or extremely excited about, the project you're working on, your job in general, and you have somebody who's just kind of there, right? Quit and stayed. That definitely is a difficult one for a lot of people to manage. So first is identifying what it is for you. What kind of people are the ones you find most difficult. Anticipate them. So we learn by observing people, by focusing on them, by reading them, so to speak. They're verbals, they're not nonverbals, and that helps us to understand who they are, and it helps us to identify those types of behaviors that we might find difficult. Take the opportunity to learn from each situation, though, because honestly, when you think about it, every single time you deal with somebody you consider challenging and you get through it somehow, you have just learned a great lesson. You've just, utilized some new skills. But taking the time to step back and evaluate that and to say, I didn't know if I could do this. I was going to go about it this way, but I did this, and this worked for me. So kind of being a little introspective sometimes to be able to recognize that. Somebody else just asked a question. What is the best way to handle one of your employees if they are unapproachable and always gets on the defense with any conversation? Great question, because that's one of those really difficult moments for managers or for anybody who's trying to give any kind of feedback, where people just aren't willing to accept it and they get defensive. So first and foremost, I think I would check myself. I would, if I'm giving the feedback, I would think about the way that I'm giving the feedback. Am I giving feedback that that person would be willing to accept? Am I speaking about it in terms that are really factual, specific, or am I throwing out these general comments which somebody can naturally feel like they're being attacked? So I would always start with me as the person who's giving the feedback and make sure that I am doing the best job possible in terms of giving the feedback appropriately. But if, in fact, you are doing everything right and it's the person on the receiving end that no matter what it is, always gets defensive, for me, and this is coming from an HR person, to me, that's a performance issue. That's part of the skills that are necessary to be a really good employee and a really good team member. And that's feedback that you would need to give to them in a way that is constructive. Right? So saying to that person, I want to talk to you about the way that you accept any kind of feedback. Anytime I approach you, your responses have been, and be really, really specific. Don't just throw around things like, oh, you get really angry, oh, you don't pay attention, your eyes start rolling. Don't give them those kinds of things, because that definitely could feel like a personal attack. But what did they say? So when I gave you the feedback that the report you did wasn't as good, the first thing that you did was said, that wasn't me, that was so-and-so's part. Well, so basically you weren't taking responsibility. And so I would like to see you do this in those situations. And really, it's an opportunity to coach somebody and to really teach them and think about it. I mean, you can really have an impact on somebody. Maybe this person's been doing this over and over and over again, with various managers, and nobody's taken the time to do it. So if you can get through to that person and really help them to change their behavior, then that really could be an awesome thing for your team, for you as a manager, and most certainly in the development of the person. Somebody said, focus on the behavior, not the attitude. Exactly. So attitude is an opinion. You can describe behavior. That's exactly right. When you focus on attitude, it almost feels like a personal insult. Where if you focus on behaviors, it's what you did, it's what you said. And so people can easily look at that and pull themselves away from that, and not take it personally. Somebody said, if you just asked, did you read your email, she took it as I thought she was unable to do her job, which I never given any indication that she wasn't. Oh, okay. So I guess the person who had asked the question in the first place, so said to that person, did you read your email? And immediately that person started getting defensive, like you're questioning their abilities. So how can you say it differently, right? Instead of saying, if you asked, did you read your email? Maybe if you said it rather than making that a question, which then makes me feel like, what are you testing me here or something? Saying something like, why don't you go back to that email? I'm pretty sure I had said in the email, or it said in the email X. So take a look at that just to make sure. So basically you're giving them some direction, some advice, rather than, kind of the questioning. So that would be one way of doing it. All right, I'm going to keep going. We've got 3 minutes left, and I've got a few more things I want to make sure that we cover. So relying on other teammates to make things better, that's really, really a helpful thing. So maybe you're having trouble with a particular person, but other people are not. Maybe you can learn from those other people, get some advice from those other people on how to handle that person. Because as we said before, we all have different perceptions of who a difficult person is. So I may think that person's not difficult at all. You might think they're impossible to work with. So maybe I can give you, as another team member, some advice on how I handle that person and what to do. And then lastly, laughing. Laughter lightens the atmosphere. Laughter is contagious. Now, laughter, it's got to be appropriate laughter, not laughing at somebody, but creating an atmosphere where it's just, we make light of it rather than going head to head. That definitely makes a difference when we're dealing with somebody that we consider difficult. A couple of other things when it comes to communication, and we actually talked about a lot of these things already. So making sure, again, as the manager, that you're approachable, people feel comfortable coming to you and asking you questions or letting you know the bad news if something's not working. Using that respectful tone and that open body language, so those nonverbals that we talked about. Be as exact as possible. So once again, when be as specific, as detailed as you can, and not, kind of making vague comments about things. Using lots of positive language. This is just such a great thing that every manager should be doing, and hopefully we do that in our teams. If we listen to the conversation, the back and forth that people are having, does it tend to be more positive, or does it tend to be more negative? Is it more words like we can't, it's not going to work, your problem, or is it, more of that we got this, we're going to make this work, we'll figure it out? Right? So our language really does have an impact on how we interact with each other. We talked a lot about listening and how important that is to actively listen to people. It's okay to play devil's advocate sometimes, but make sure, again, that it's appropriate. It's being done because we really want to look at things from a different perspective. And with that, of course, being open to those new ideas, asking and offering more feedback, and patience. Patience is a really, really important skill for everybody, and when a manager can model that, that makes a difference. So together, everyone achieves more. Acronym for TEAM, right? So when we acknowledge other people's contributions and ideas, we give them the credit, right? This starts sounding like some of the great great experiences of teamwork that you all mentioned earlier, right? Inviting that creativity and new ideas, because that's just going to make us more innovative, being truthful, creating that trust, keeping confidences, that's another really important one, keeping promises and commitments coming through, being reliable, recognizing the value that everybody brings, both internally and externally, and again, building that trust and support for each other. So the last thing, and I apologize, I know we're right at the top of the hour. I just want to do one more thing here. So positive reinforcement on teams really, really does work. So working with those positive attitudes, believing in your people and helping them to believe in each other, being kind. You can kill a bee with honey, right? And get what you need out of somebody sometimes by just being kind and thoughtful and taking that extra minute rather than sometimes being in such a hurry where maybe we bark out commands and unfortunately that backfires on us. And of course, always taking the high road. You know, even if other team members or somebody on your team isn't treating you very well, we never want to act in kind. We always want to take that high road, do the right thing, and most importantly, recognize that we're all in this together. And I said before, the team is only going to be as strong as the weakest link, and the success of the team really rests on everybody's shoulders. Also, can't leave you without the commercial. You know your EAP is there to help you, provide you with information, resources, assistance on anything, especially as a leader with your teams. If any of your team members are having any kinds of issues outside of the workplace, please refer them to the EAP. The toll-free number is up there. The login for the website is on the slide here. Please refer them to that so that they can get any assistance that they need. It's free to them and you and family members. It is available 24/7, 365 days a year. It's confidential, so a great, great resource to help you. So with that said, I'm going to close it off now. Thank you for sticking with me throughout this. Thanks for all your questions and comments during the session, and I hope I get to talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.